Firstly, thank you to Sport Med BC, primarily for continuing to be the legs and sometimes the heartbeat and sometimes the stomach to this program. A program like this does not continue to grow and it doesn't continue to evolve unless you have people who are integrally involved and willing to continue to be drivers of it. The people that are speaking today are all people that have embraced the concept and I think in lots of ways continue to evolve the concept. So I'll just give you a little bit about how this kind of got rolling. And I think we have this really fortunate opportunity. Darcy Musselman, who has joined the Sport Med BC and is a chiropractor from Victoria, and if those of you who haven't met Darcy, she should really be up here as well, because what she's also done is infused all of us on the program to really look at this screening tool and keep it moving along. But the best chance I had to understand what it is I think you need to know about this tool is watching Darcy as we spoke about the evolution of this program. Because as I was speaking to why do we do this and why do we continue to do this test or this posture or this position or how do we draw these pictures, you could just tell that Darcy was kind of formulating a concept that the Sport Med BC I think will continue to move with. So without further ado, I'll continue on. And so just to give you a little bit of an evolution of the program, the woman you see soaring over the Chateau Frontenac there is Veronica Brenner, and she, for me, has been part of the inspiration to keep going at this. She really kind of embodies what the program has to offer, and I'll give you a little story about her later. In 1997, Rob Kober, who is now the head coach of the Canadian Freestyle Ski Team, wanted to do an assessment of his athletes, and Drew Mitchell at the time phoned me up and said, I don't really have a clue what he wants, but maybe this is something that you might be interested in. My background, the purpose to me becoming a physio was that during the very, very crucial part of the development of my really ridiculously short-lived career as a volleyball player, was very much altered, because in those really meaty years of technical skill development, I had the most ridiculous bilateral patellofemoral syndrome. So I was 15. I was not a bad volleyball player, but I had bilateral knee pain that really precluded me from being able to attend camps, do a lot of things. It wasn't until I met a physio who took a look at my mechanics and said, I think we could actually change this. That was about 30 years ago. And so I met this physio. I thought, what a great career. If somebody could change movement mechanics, if somebody could alter these things and get me back on the court, wow, what if I could do that for someone else? So we segue forward, Rob and Drew, and they start chatting about, well, do you think there would be room for? And so I started looking for tools online, tools in different journals, and there weren't a lot of assessment tools that were being used. So we went up to Whistler, and if you think this is a sexy program, I need to dispel that rumor instantly, because often we work in really sweaty little corners. Worst place I've ever had to do the assessment protocol was in the kitchen of the Archery Club somewhere up in the hills near Harrison, on a butcher block table. That was the only room space they had for us to do these assessments. So it is not a ridiculously sexy program we deliver, but it is good. So they stuck us in a little sweaty corner of the Mountain Park, and the very first athlete, and Rob Kober watched this whole thing. He stood in the room, and I have to urge you as coaches, and I'll drive this point home again later, when you are present for this testing, the value of the program goes up exponentially, because you get to witness what it is as a coach. You might be working on a technical skill, and the athlete keeps butting up against something that he can't perform, and there's Rob standing there, and I demonstrate to him that this athlete has about 5 degrees of internal rotation on his hip. Do you think 5 degrees of internal rotation on a hip is sufficient to ski a mogul well? No, you cannot edge. You cannot deliver that edge. You cannot start to absorb with 5 degrees of hip internal rotation. And Rob lit up like a Christmas tree, because all of a sudden, him standing on the second jump, yelling at his athlete to absorb on the left, he really understood instantly. And for me, it was, the lights went on instantly. I thought, this has to happen, because historically, and I'm just old enough that I came into the sport milieu when we were thinking we were really hot potatoes because we were getting sport specific. And we were, treating athletes as sport specific and developing power for jumping sports and endurance for endurance sports. And that was kind of the nomenclature of the day. And all of a sudden I thought, no, that's insufficient. This has to be athlete specific, sport specific. So that's really kind of what started this whole thing rolling. And what we tried to deliver, what we tried to do is keep coming back to the question, could we improve performance and could we minimize the likelihood of injuries that keep athletes out of really integral times in their training careers? For sure, the tool was initially looked at as a tool for adolescent athletes. So a lot of it was about trying to marry their developmental stages, their strength, but looking at tests that might be quite easily synthesized into a prescription. And I always think this young man, I took this picture like 12 years ago of a young man who wanted to go on to be a basketball player. And in one word or less, why? Why am I doing this? Because of this. Because a head position like this, a scapular position like this, shoulder position like this, a pelvis position like this is for me the recipe for disaster, even if it's just the fact that he wanted to get into the gym and start lifting weights. For me, that's just a really good shoulder impingement looking for a place to happen. And so if I have the opportunity to help him with this, because we have a few tools that we can kind of synthesize out and pick some best strategies, maybe, just maybe, we'll prevent a sequence of movement patterns and substitution patterns that will ultimately contribute to injury or decrease performance. So that was why. And so we kind of thought, well, if we functionally test these people and we kind of monitor these athletes, maybe we'll have fewer days lost to training, fewer days lost to competition, and perhaps we'll have better performance. There weren't a lot of tools, and there still aren't a lot of great tools. I was just chatting with Rick Celebrini, who was down in Phoenix doing the Suns training camp and looking at their screening tool, and we had a good laugh because you can advertise this. We have a better screening tool than the Phoenix Suns. Really, this tool is better in terms of its overall and its micro and macro. Rick wants our program, so I think we should sell it to the Suns. Anyway, slightly more than we sell it to the amateur athletes in BC. But there aren't a lot of tools, and there certainly isn't a lot of research validating these testing positions, testing protocols. So all of us clinically get comfortable with positions and postures that we know give us a lot of value, give us a lot of information, or give us the capacity to make a reasonably wide prescription. But there's not a lot in the papers. And so I sat with an SFU math prof. I have an SPS database of like 650 athletes from 29 different sports with 5,000 entries of different positions. And I said, well, but this test isn't actually reliable or valid in a scientific way. And she said, if you wait for all these tests to be scientifically valid, you will never produce this information. She said, sometimes we can produce information by finding better ways, by using this kind of information. So that excites me because I think, okay, so there aren't a lot of tools out there, but we have the process and the capacity to generate a lot of information. So perhaps our tool will continue to evolve to such a point that we could use it on a broader base for more sports. The assessment team, so although I'm speaking primarily about the functional assessment tool, and you'll hear to it later, there are a lot of members of the team. And initially we had physios and athletic trainers, we had strength and conditioning specialists, physicians. We had some dietitians traveling in the early days when we did the camps. And it depends then on the team's needs. For certain, we've had the sports psych and mental trainers coming out as well. Those are sort of more when we're involved with a team camp or a team sort of setting up their team cycle coming up to a Canada Games. But that's a big team of practitioners, a big team of specialists that the amateur athletes in this province have now been able to gain access to. Okay. And the assessment approach. The assessment tool itself, it is not age specific, and that's one of the beautiful things is now, I mean, we used it with the curling team who are average age of probably 38. It takes a little longer to deliver because most of the 38-year-olds have more physical baggage than the 14-year-olds. But it is a tool that can be used, and it's not gender-specific, and it's not sport-specific. It is person-specific. The tool involves mechanisms of posture, muscle balance, joint-specific flexibility, a bit of core strength, and Clyde will speak to this a little bit later in terms of body awareness and proprioception. The point of it is to be able to synthesize out, is this athlete's body more predisposed to injury or lacking or showing us signs that would ultimately limit performance? We're constantly trying to synthesize out that information. So we aren't getting into small degrees and measures, although there are a few joints that we are very specific about, but it is macro in some of its application. And as I said, it's just really trying to synthesize out information that would make us think about a prescription. So we look at posture, we do some static, we do some sport-specific postures, we do a little bit of lower extremity, pelvis, spine, shoulder. Interestingly, I'll give you just a little bit of stats here. When we initially drew out just a couple of tests from this spreadsheet that we had, 75% of the athletes that had been tested at that time, between the ages of 12 and 18, 75% of them had had access to or used the services of a physiotherapist for an injury. That, to me, is a ridiculously high proportion of athletes that have had to access health care. 60% of them had used massage or chiropractic. So we had a huge pool of athletes who were already into a mechanism of injury management in their adolescence. To me, those are not the ones that are going to go on to high performance without a great deal of involvement. So, and the other thing that we found is that, just kind of interesting little snippets, the two sports that generated the greatest variance in flexibility were hockey and cycling. So those two groups of athletes have proportionately poorer flexibility through the lumbar spine, hips, and pelvis than other sports. If you want your kid to have ankle problems, let them be a soccer player. Unless, of course, you want to provide them with a balance board, and then you reduce the likelihood of ankle injuries a little bit. But it was just, the tool has also allowed us to find that there are some trends. There are some interesting trends. The sailors all have lower back problems, and that we know sort of practically. Those of us in the clinic that treat sailors kind of go, oh boy, here we go again. But also the numbers sort of verified and validated that. So if we had a clinician of any discipline who really likes sailing and maybe wanted to get involved in the sailing program, that might be a really good place for preventative medicine, getting these athletes before they start going down the road of disc bulges and disc herniations and facet irritations. So I think one of the other things that sort of leached out of this program is that there are practitioners who are now focusing on prehabilitation, preventative medicine, because of some of the information that we're learning. Muscle balance and function, exercise prescription. So what good is a tool of this nature in terms of athlete usefulness and team usefulness if we don't have a really good prescriptive tool, if we don't have a really good way of giving them information? So the athlete leaves the testing protocol with a little page, sometimes with pictures on it, sometimes with handouts from the therapist or the clinician that's working with them. Our follow-up isn't the best. That, I can certainly tell you, is a little bit of a hiccup in this protocol because we really, really rely heavily on parents, coaches, and athletes being involved and engaged in using this information. And there isn't a terrific strategy because it's costly for the teams. I mean, we do year over year for some of the teams. We've done senior women's golf team has us out every year, and we've been keeping their sheets and keeping their assessment forms, and it's really cool what happens year over year. But that doesn't always happen. So how we deliver that message, and this is sort of, it comes down to basic teaching skills. You don't give a young athlete 12 exercises, you give them 3 or 4 really important ones. Or you tell them, okay, if you do nothing else, you need to do these 2 things because these 2 things will have the greatest potential to have the greatest effect. And that teaching, so what we've developed is a team of therapists and clinicians who we believe are really good at delivering that message. People who are engaging, people who understand the sport, understand the lingo. The paddlers had to pull us aside one time because we weren't using appropriate lingo. You want to lose a teenager's interest? Call paddling rowing. They look at you like, you have no clue what you're doing here, do you? So we've understood, and I'm actually learning a lot about teenagers because I watch when they roll their eyes. I know the message isn't going to really go very far. So the other thing is that our team of clinicians, we've really tried to find people who can understand that sport milieu. They don't call a baseball diamond a pitch. Just the vernacular, it really helps drive that message home. The coach's involvement, it really is program specific. Some coaches grab this stuff and run with it. We have the strength conditioning person there. They've got somebody on their program on a regular basis. They grab it and run with it. That's our best day. Our worst day is when the coach doesn't show up for the testing, The athletes haven't been told what it's all about and have no clue how they're going to use this information because, quite frankly, I quite know then that maybe 20% of those kids are going to use it. We've had only 2 instances in all of my time with this where an athlete has asked us not to communicate the information to the coaches. So most of the time we sit down with the coaches, well, almost all the time, and do a debrief because that's the tool that's how it's going to get on the field. That's how it's going to carry over to functional delivery of this. But we've had 2 instances where athletes have asked us not to communicate that information, and truly it is health information, it is a screening tool. That is their right to not have, it is their right to keep that information confidential. It would suggest that they're probably not engaging themselves in the process of the team. Most of the time, the 2 times the athletes have been concerned that they would be cut because of medical information that they thought the coaches, the reality is the coach probably knows anyways because they'll be seeing that demonstration on the field or on the pitch. And we do this teaching session on site. It happens immediately. We don't try to, bring them back in. We don't try. We try not to create any delay. We try to have that information delivered to them instantly, in a way, in vernacular, in style that improves the likelihood of it being carried on. So follow up, coaches. It is really fun when a program has trainers that work with them specifically because then we know that there's somebody sort of watching and policing and encouraging and monitoring the process of that. We do also really love to see parents coming out because it usually suggests a certain level of interest or involvement in their children's career. So what have we learned? Interesting macro programs. So I mentioned a little bit about flexibility, the cyclists and the hockey players. We certainly noticed that the young women in gymnastics, interestingly, aren't all that strong through their shoulder girdles. They have certain muscle groups that are ridiculously strong and certain muscle groups that aren't that strong. So muscle imbalance in a gymnastics program would be a really good sort of preventative medicine approach if you're a clinician looking for some extra work or looking for a program to be involved in. We have had immediate changes in programs. So 5 years ago, maybe even more, we tested the swim team out at UBC, the swim program, so the Dolphins program, and every athlete came in with that really predictable swimmer's posture, tight lats, anteriorly rotated shoulder girdles, 80% of them complaining of shoulder pain, mild impingement, swimmer's shoulder. They all had that sort of, that was close. They had that sort of real postural give. There was just no apportment at all with their posture. We went back a year later and we did not prescribe thoracic flexibility and shoulder girdle exercises. I think we did to maybe one of them of the entire program. So the coaching staff, the team, the people that were doing their dryline work really took to heart our recommendations because it was so blatant and so obvious. It was like the big elephant in the room sort of. But I think we probably delivered our message really clearly, and they changed their program very tangibly. And by the next year, those changes were evident in the testing. And I think you can ask for a better outcome. So I have to just tell a quick story about Veronica. So Veronica's a very dear friend of mine now, and I traveled with the ski team. I started in 1997, 98. That's when I met Rob. That would probably be why. So it's never put that together. Veronica had a really long career on the World Cup Tour. So 14 years, 10 years on the World Cup Tour, including many podiums, 2-time world champion in aerials. Those of you who aren't familiar with aerials, the women are going off a double kicker, so they're probably about 45 feet in the air above the snow, spinning and twisting, doing doubles and triples. Veronica is one of the few women that was doing triples at the peak of her career. It's ridiculous. And they land hard, and depending on the snow conditions and the wind conditions. So a lot of them have sort of a chronic low-grade history of all sorts of interesting things. And Veronica had SI joint issues. She had gone as far as having SI injections in her career. Interestingly, she also tore the ACL on the same side as that SI joint instability. So, you know, the physio, thinker, problem solver in me just was percolating. So when I joined the program, and this tool, this functional tool was kind of developing at the same time, the coach of the aerials program at the time said, I have a plan. And so 2 years before Salt Lake City, he took myself and their trainer at the time, and we went and this one was a bit of a tough sell, but we took the aerials ski team to Maui for a training camp. That was a little bit of a tougher sell. People look at me like, right, yes, we get it. Just should point out that the athletes ran a golf tournament and self-funded their training camp to Maui. And we did testing with every athlete, and we designed programs, and we sat with the trainer and the coach and the athlete, and we designed the program leading up. Then 18 months before Salt Lake City, we redid it, and we checked the things that we were concerned about. Leading up to Salt Lake City Olympics, we had not one athlete on the team, men's and women's teams, and at the time we had 8 guys who had like potential to be on the World Cup aerials team, 4 of them. So we had 4 men that went to the Olympics and 3 women that went to the Olympics. We didn't lose one training day because of low-grade overuse chronic injuries that season. That's unheard of. At the Olympics, we had 3 guys make the finals, 3 women make the finals, and we walked away with a gold and a silver. A silver and a bronze. And Veronica was really poignant in the fact that, and Nick Bass, the coach at the time, just said that although they did a lot of things very deliberately, and they did a great job of looking at their goal competition date and working backwards from that competition date, one of the tools that they felt they could not even have come close to was using this screening tool and using this assessment protocol to design that off-season, pre-season, mid-season training regime. And that to me, I mean, I'm absolutely thrilled, because that to me is just one of those tools. If we're really looking at performance and we're looking at goals and we're looking at, you know, what is the objective of a particular competitive sport vehicle, I don't think you can do without it.